Just very briefly, the Brenthurst Library is a private collection set up by Harry Oppenheimer. We have a really incredible collection of books, of manuscripts, of pamphlets, and of art, with a big focus on the Southern African region. The collection that I'm talking to you about today is the Brenthurst collection of Southern African art. It's a big project that we've undertaken. I'll talk to you a little bit about the history and the significance of the collection. It really is just a snapshot into it. I don't have enough time to talk about the really in-depth history, so just a little bit of that. I'll move on to our conservation efforts with the collection and our research. Sort of ending with two case studies as very practical applications of both the conservation and the research that we've been doing. The collection was collected in the 1970s and 80s by a man named Jonathan Lowen. He was a South African-born lawyer living at London in the time. He still lives in London now. His intention for collecting was simple. He believed that Southern African arts were not as appreciated as those of Central and Western Africa, which at the time were forming part of collections all over the world. And so he sought to represent the beauty and the skill of Southern African art in this collection. He was also incredibly passionate about repatriation. We have to remember this was in the 1970s and 80s, and I do think in some ways he was ahead of his time. He was collecting this collection with the intention that it would be repatriated to South Africa. He visited us in January with his really lovely wife, Eve. And he spoke about how he accumulated this collection across different auctions and across different places. And his wife tells the story of how they lived in this house with their children. And Jonathan just kept accumulating and accumulating and accumulating this collection. And eventually all of them and the objects couldn't fit in the house anymore. So the decision was taken to sell the collection. It was then purchased by Harry Oppenheimer in 1986, and it was brought back to South Africa in the mid-1980s. It was then put on permanent loan to the Johannesburg Art Gallery, and it formed part of a really major exhibition in the early 90s. It remained at the Johannesburg Art Gallery until 2022, when it was rehoused at the Brenthurst Library. Jonathan Lowen has since compiled various other extensive collections, all with a really strong focus on Southern African arts, although noting that some of the collections have a little bit of a stronger focus on headrests. One of his collections focuses more strongly on staffs and clubs. So it is important to note that the names of the makers in this collection are largely unknown. Artists' names were not recorded when collecting. It is possible, though, that a lot of these objects came to be on auction in the UK through missionary travel. So it's likely that the names of the artists were never recorded. In selling the collection, a catalogue was put together, and it really was a fantastic job, but some of the information in the catalogue is incorrect. So we do note that there are missing links and there is missing information, which we're working towards recovering in our research process, which I'll speak a little bit more about just now. In our catalogues, each object is associated with a culture, and that can be because of the kind of material that was being used, style characteristics, time period. Although we note that a lot of that information we do think is incorrect. So we're working on recovering and understanding those things. There are 862 objects in the collection, so it's really, really large. It has an incredibly diverse material in the collection. There are diverse time periods, diverse geographical regions, styles, and intended use. The collection is also very utilitarian by nature. It was made to be used. Some objects were used in life, and some objects were made for the tourist trade. But often on the objects there's a proof of use. The oils of the hands of the users remain on the object. And so it's really interesting to see that kind of relationship That's also something that we keep in mind and we try to protect as far as possible in our conservation treatments. So these are all aspects that are taken into account when we look at research and conservation. There is an article on our website by Jonathan Lowen where he goes a lot more in depth on how he was collecting at the time, what his sort of catalysts for collecting were, his really, really early as a child first encounters with sort of Southern African objects. And it's really well written, and I would like to urge you all to go and read it if you have some time. I do also just want to say that the collection is incredibly diverse in what it is. So we have things from headrests to staffs to snuff boxes to figures to fertility dolls. I feel like this presentation is sort of a microcosm of the collection. It doesn't, I don't think, give a really good overview of what we have in our collection. So if you are in Joburg, please come visit it. Come visit us, come see what we have. It really is a really, really special collection. In terms of conservation efforts, so we've been performing extensive conservation treatments on the collection with a strong focus on preventative conservation. We teamed up with the University of Pretoria. We felt that we didn't have the expertise to deal with the very fragile beadwork that we have in the collection. We have an extensive beadwork collection. And so we teamed up with University of Pretoria, specifically Dr. Isabel McGinn. She's a very well-respected conservator, and she runs a master's program in tangible heritage conservation. That is Isabel over there and some of the master students. I'll talk about why we were filming it just now. So we work with the students on a sort of internship basis where they get to work on the collection. And I think just in general, it's been a really incredible relationship. The kind of work that's come out of just Funvo House in general, out of UP and from the students has been really, really impressive. All of the other objects are conserved in-house, a lot of them by me. Yeah, so when the collection was moved from the Johannesburg Art Gallery to the Brenthurst Library originally, we performed an anoxia treatment. Anoxia treatment is essentially a removal of all air. So our objects are placed in a container and we remove all the air over a span of time to prevent any bugs, kill any potential threats that could not only threaten the Brenthurst collection, but our other collections of books and manuscripts. Storage is a really important part of preventative conservation. We store everything in museum-grade boxes with acid-free tissue paper nests. We are currently working on our aircon system to introduce aircons that control humidity and temperature. They're also able to remove mold spores from the air. So that would be really beneficial for us to remove them in terms of preventing mold from growing in the future. There are obviously other conservation concerns besides kind of environmental control. Mold is one of the ones that we deal with to some extent. Previously, the collection was stored in quite a humid environment. And once you see mold growing on an object, it's late. The mold is in the object. And so you need to treat that with ethanol to try and get rid of the mold and prevent it from regrowing, because as much as we can dry brush mold off, it will regrow eventually. So we create humidity chambers where ethanol is able to evaporate onto our objects and sit on the objects in a way that it doesn't harm the object as much as if we would treat it with cotton wool soaked in ethanol directly on the object. So we're really, really conscious of these kinds of processes and how to deal with those things and what is best for our objects. Another thing that we deal with quite often is glass disease. It's the result of a poor manufacturing process. It's commonly found in Venetian glass, And we know that the Brenthurst collection, our glass beads are often made from either Venetian or European glass. The difficult thing with glass disease is that it can't be stopped. Once the degradation has started, it continues. We can stabilize it as much as possible, so we can prevent and slow down the process of the glass degrading. But there's not much that we can do in terms of reversing glass disease. A lot of the things that we do in conservation involve removing dust, which I know sounds like quite a simple conservation treatment, but it's really important. We remove dust and insect carcasses and any other potential threats to the object while trying to keep the proof of use as intact as possible. There is absolutely no standardized treatment. We have to treat everything on a case-to-case basis, although we do dry clean everything in our collection. And then we just kind of listen to the object and we go with what it needs specifically. When objects are particularly fragile, we will reach out to Isabel at Van Vo House and just kind of get any additional assistance there. So this is a really good example of preventative conservation. There's a kind of relationship between conservation and authenticity. How far do you take a conservation treatment? At Brenthurst, we do focus on preventative conservation rather than aesthetic conservation. So we don't want to remove any of the kind of accretions gained during the working life of the object. So this is one of our gourd snuff boxes. And it had split completely. So if you can see the way that it's made, there are stress points from the wire being inserted into the snuff box. And so there's these kind of stress points that are created where the gourd just eventually split. And while we could put it back together and make it look like it had never split, it helps us understand the rest of our collection. We've got a lot of other gourd snuff boxes as well. So it helps us understand the age of the object, how it was made, and it helps us understand how our other gourd objects might weather or might age. Digitization is also a part of our conservation process. We are in the process of digitizing. We have to date digitized about half of our collection, and we're working on the other half in the coming months. We're also working on creating open access to the collection. So a domain where it would be readily available online for researchers, free to use. There is a video on our website where we talk a little bit more about the conservation efforts, and where you see from this image where we were filming with UP. So an example of our kind of storage methods, these are acid-free museum-grade boxes. Acid-free tissue paper, and so just kind of supporting the objects as much as possible, giving them a really comfortable resting place. And then there's kind of different interventions sometimes where beadwork, it's a belt that wraps all the way around, and when you lay it flat, you get these kind of stress points on the edges. So it's really important for us to just create safe, comfortable spaces for these objects to stay in storage for a little while and not degrade and not put stress on the objects. This is sort of examples of the work that Van Vo had done, creating really amazing little ties so that when you move things between storage spaces, they don't slip and slide, and then a really inventive these fold over, and it's obviously made of all conservation-friendly things. In terms of researching the collection, we do acknowledge that there are missing links. So our sort of focus on this is researching to recover lost knowledge and to create links between objects, cultures, and geographical regions. This gives us direct access into the cultural practices of a group in a particular point in time, and the ability to interpret the past and understand how these objects might exist in the future. The research depends on the nature of the object. We have to take a diverse approach. One of our approaches is using existing literature. There is a lot that has been written. We see often crossovers between other collections and objects that we have in our collections, made possibly by similar cultural groups at similar times, and sometimes even we question if they weren't made by the same person. Yeah, so there's this moment of existing literature that we're using, but there's also really exciting interviews going to happen with Jonathan Lowen. So when he was in Joburg in January, he was really excited about seeing the collection for, I think, in the last 40 years, likely. And so he was telling us stories of how he acquired certain things, and he remembered every single object and where he acquired them, how they came to be in the collection, why they came to be in the collection. And so Jonathan has agreed to a series of interviews with us, which will start taking place really soon. So that's a really important part, I think, of our interview process and our research process, is gaining this knowledge straight from the original collector. We also have other researchers. James Green is one of them. He is the curator of the Yale African Art Collection. He is loaning a couple of our objects for an exhibition in Yale in 2025, but he's been incredibly forthcoming with information. He visited us in February and he's due back in November. Yeah, and I think there's just this really incredible moment of sharing information. We're also involved with Mbali Mtetwa. She is an expert in traditional beadwork methods. And so in the conservation process, ensuring that we have, if beads are being reattached, that they're being reattached in a style that is true to the object. So these are our Tandu snuff boxes. These were the very first thing in the collection that I ever researched, and so these make me particularly excited. I was really interested in their making, and just very quickly to explain how they're made. Either a cow or a camel is slaughtered and the skin is then soaked in salt water for about 5 days. And that skin is divided into two separate layers, your corium layer and your adipose layer. And the adipose layer is wrapped around a clay maquette. And so I was really interested in this technique because we had this collection of 6 of them, but I wasn't seeing this technique anywhere else in the collection. Yeah, so we found that they originate from the HASA people in northern Nigeria, and we were really interested in how the southern Nguni came to use the technique. We've considered trade routes, so the technique has also been found in India and Iran. So we've sort of looked at just tracing migration patterns and trade routes, and potentially the technique was taught from Nigeria to India and then came to South Africa in that way. I want to quickly show you our 2 Basotho fertility dolls. We acknowledge that these things are not playthings. They're not often used by children, nor do they represent children. There is a move in sort of international standards towards calling these objects child figures, which also doesn't quite fit because, again, they don't represent children, nor are they used by children. So we have the Nguana Modula and the Banaba Pelego. They were symbols of fertility and prosperity and the sort of continuity of cultural practices. Both men and women had a role in making these, so the men would go out and source the materials and they would hollow out the wooden core. And then they would present the woman with the kind of bones of the child figure. And then it was the woman's responsibility to adorn and to decorate. And we do see that in our collection, the colours are distinctively Sotho. These dolls were used by women who were not able to have children. The figures were kept as incredibly prized parts of the household. They were taken care of like real children until a baby was born. And when a baby was born, They were then taken to the riverbank and they were laid to rest. Just kind of conservation interventions from the University of Pretoria. These dolls are incredibly fragile, and so lifting them out of boxing creates different stress points all around. So they created boxing that opens in the front, and so the dolls are able to be pulled out. In terms of just other conservation concerns, glass beads are incredibly sensitive to light, although it has been shown that coloured beads are less sensitive than sort of clear glass beads. They are still sensitive to light. And so we maintain stabilising our humidity, stabilising our temperature, minimalising any light exposure, so that we can sort of stabilise these objects for as long as possible. I did want to speak about a little bit more about the sort of conservation interventions, but yeah, I'm going to leave it there for now. Thank you.